this day. SI's Pat Forty is with us from Louisville as well, and not commenting on the open music, I assume, Pat. But man, calm before the storm here. It feels like a little bit. These next 2 weeks promise to be wild.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot of games here that are kind of prelude games where the contenders just need to get through them, and then wow, it's on. Rivalry week is going to be as heated and dramatic and tense, I think, as we've seen in a long time, because there's a lot of teams still with a lot at stake.
Yes, and a lot of them preparing to face one another, and then I think conference championship week can have a huge impact as well on this CFP. But as it is, the CFP rankings kind of holding steady. It was the big story last night. There was one significant change from the Big Ten's point of view. Ohio State did lose its grip on the top spot. They were replaced by Georgia. The knock against the Dogs all along had been resume, but they now have 2 top 15 wins. So they move up. They're passing the Buckeyes, who now only have the 1 top 15 win as Notre Dame has fallen out. Michigan holding steady at 3 after taking down Penn State. Future Big Ten members, Washington, Oregon, still 5 and 6. And look who made the single biggest jump in the nation last week. The Iowa Hawkeyes up 6 spots to number 16. Let's talk about the change at the top first, Pat. And it's clearly no fault of Ohio State's. I mean, I think you can make the argument they're playing their best football of the year. Their resume, a little bit of the shine's been taken off it just because Notre Dame has proven not to be a great team. They're a good team. But Georgia has a couple impressive wins in a row. I assume you're comfortable with this change?
Yeah, I think so. And you could kind of see it coming with the schedule that Georgia was facing. So given the fact that not only are they playing better competition, but playing extremely well, I mean, what they did to Mississippi was, wow, that was powerful on Saturday night. And Georgia's really put together their offense now. They've come a long way on that side of the ball. This is not a defense that's as good as 2021 or 2022, but it's still very good. And now you've got an offense playing about as well as they did last year. And you start stacking up wins that are against marquee opponents. And yes, I thought this was where the committee would go. I think Georgia can obviously strengthen and or maintain that spot this week playing Tennessee. But then what happens after that? If you get the Ohio State-Michigan winner, could they jump back ahead? So this could go back and forth still a couple of times, I think, between the top team in the Big Ten and the Bulldogs.
And the committee claims, as you know, Pat, that they start with a clean sheet every week. But, we're allowed to sort of, try to progress our minds forward over the next couple of weeks. And what results could end up meaning for the teams who are going to be in the mix here. And for both Ohio State and Michigan being at 2 and 3, it's significant. But Ohio State dropping from the top spot down to number 2, you do wonder. So if you do, whoever ends up being perhaps a one-loss squad that doesn't make the Big Ten championship game, but still definitively looks like one of the best in America, then how does that impact everything? And, where the Iowa Hawkeyes are rated, how the rest of the Big Ten as a conference is regarded. The committee talks through all those things to form their top 25, but Ohio State being 2 as opposed to 1 doesn't feel like a big deal right now, but it does make me a little bit curious is how does the committee view the rest of the depth of the Big Ten? Because I would imagine you mentioned Iowa being at 16. That to me is not only about how they view the Hawkeyes, but an impressive win over a Rutgers squad that we heard from the committee last week that they were very impressed by Rutgers and what that meant to the resume of both Michigan and Ohio State up to that point in the season. So I do wonder a little bit just as we kind of start to piece this thing together, what it will mean, not only for an undefeated Big Ten champ, that's the easy one, but is there still a legitimate possibility of 2 teams in? It feels like a difficult season for that to happen.
I think if Iowa were to run the table, that certainly helps whoever gets to the Big Ten championship game, right? Because you could go through a scenario where, Georgia, Alabama in the SEC championship game. If the Big Ten team has jumped Georgia by virtue of beating the other one, right, on next weekend, then you get to the SEC championship game and the Big Ten championship game. Is the quality of opponents seen at the same level? Right. Truthfully, I'm just not sure there's that much riding on whether the Big Ten champ is number 1 or number 2. I don't know whether you'd agree here, Pat. I've always felt like that's a bigger deal for the SEC champ to be number 1 because they get to pick where they play then in the first college football playoff semifinal. And this year you've got the Sugar Bowl, which clearly the SEC team would want to play in over the Rose Bowl. I don't think it's nearly as relevant for the Big Ten teams historically, and I don't think it would be this year either. I don't think it's that big a deal whether you're 1 or 2.
I agree. Yeah, geography is not nearly as big a factor because so many of the bowl games that are tied into the playoff are located in the south of the southeast, and so that's why it matters a little bit more there. Whereas Michigan, Ohio State, you're going to travel regardless, and you got a lot of alums on the West Coast too. And a lot of fans that love going out to Pasadena to fill those seats. I think this is just going to be a really fascinating task for the playoff committee because there's more teams still in the mix at this point than usual.
Yeah.
We've got the 5 undefeated teams. We've got at least 3 one-loss teams that are in there and will play really important games. And the way this breaks down, they're going to have some tough decisions to make here. And I do think 2 Big Ten teams, still a possibility. 2 SEC teams, still a possibility. 2 from both? Probably not. But we'll see what happens in the Big 12, in the Pac-12, and in the ACC that's going to impact the way this all looks here in the next couple of weeks. Selection Sunday is going to be really difficult, I think, for the committee, more so than usual.
There tend to be a lot of predictions of carnage and what calamity could be if you have all these different undefeated teams. It feels like we're deeper into the season with so many different conferences represented in that conversation here with only 2 weeks to go. Future members of the Big Ten, though, Washington, Oregon, that to me is really intriguing also, where Washington's resume does feel to me like they should be in that top 4. Not that Florida State isn't exceptional as well, but it just seems to me that with where the Noles have been, and they've played through some injuries here, but Washington has continued to mount wins. And we've all been sort of singing the praises of the current version of the Pac-12 this entire season in the depth of that conference. For Washington to still be unscathed and have a win over Oregon, the number 6 team in the country, and have a win over Arizona, who the committee is continuing to vault up their rankings on a weekly basis, and a Utah squad that's amongst the best defenses in America, one of the grittiest teams in the country. That's an exceptional resume. I was, out of anything last night, frankly, the last 2 weeks, I was a little bit surprised we still saw Washington outside that top 4.
Yeah, I certainly think you can make a case for them ahead of Florida State. I mean, the truth is, if those Pac-12 teams, well, certainly if Washington wins out and ends up unscathed, someone ahead of them is guaranteed to lose, as we know, because Ohio State and Michigan are playing one another. So winning takes care of a lot of concerns. Oregon is the one where it gets really interesting, right, because they do have the loss to Washington. But no doubt this has been a really strong year for the Pac-12 and making a strong case to get a team in here in the final year of the league. I do want to move on to some of the games this weekend, and let's talk about the matchups for the ranked Big Ten teams. We are obviously thrilled that we have Ohio State on our air as they will take on Minnesota. These are always challenging games here, Pat, the week before the huge showdown. That being said, Minnesota has not played well recently, particularly on defense. Does this game concern you much for the Buckeyes, particularly given the fact that they're at home?
It doesn't. I think Ohio State, as you pointed out, they've got eyes on a big prize, and Minnesota is not clicking on all cylinders. It's been kind of shocking to see their defense be a bit exploited here recently, whereas Ohio State, they just keep putting it together a little bit at a time, and the offense is becoming more and more impressive. And we saw, obviously, they've used Marvin Harrison Jr. better and better. Trevion Henderson coming back has been huge. But now Cade Stover's back in the mix, and he had a big game, 7 catches, 79 yards, and a touchdown. You put him in the passing game. Egbuka comes back and starts making some plays, and now you got all the weapons that we expected Ohio State to have. You fine-tune things, you get past Minnesota here, and you just keep going into Ann Arbor, and I think you're going to go in feeling pretty confident about your situation.
Matchup-wise for the Gophers, Pat, they have to be the team who historically they've been when they're at their best, when they're at their most successful, because of all the weaponry that the Buckeyes can access. And they're getting healthier, to your point. You mentioned some of the names there, and they're beginning to play really well, too. And as much as we've been understandably excited about the receiver position and knowing that Emeka Egbuka being out and Cade Stover, playing through being banged up because that's just kind of who he is. It's in his DNA to still be exceptional, even if he's not at 100% physically. But, of course, Marvin Harrison Jr. as maybe the best player in America, all those things matter. What's a little bit under the radar is just how Kyle McCord is continuing to progress. And it's a couple of other quarterbacks in the conference that we talked about early in the season for what it can mean for their team if they begin to peak in November. And Kyle McCord sort of got lost in that conversation a bit. But you look at the game he played last week, magnificently efficient and decisive and accurate with the football. So he may not look like, these last couple of first-round picks at quarterback for the Buckeyes, but out of any quarterback in the conference who you can say is ascending right now in November, Kyle McCord is starting to play his best football while still being insulated by one of the best defenses in America, one of the most explosive running backs in the country. Ohio State, there's no team in the country they have to take a back seat to, even though they dropped to number 2.
I would agree 100%. It does feel like they're clicking. They're playing their best football right now. You talked about McCord. I mean, he's second in the Big Ten in passing efficiency. It means a lot to have that run game behind him and Travion Henderson. I do think that's been a huge part of their improvement. You look at Minnesota, he gave up more than 600 yards to Purdue, who's been kind of up and down offensively.
Lost the time of possession battle to Purdue.
Well, Purdue can run it now.
Yeah,
right?
well, 353 yards. They certainly ran it really well last week.
That out. They've been one of the better rushing, like outside of kind of the elite run teams in the Big Ten. They've run it fairly well. But yeah, it's tough sledding there for Minnesota. What about Michigan? It feels to me, at least on paper anyway, Pat, I mean, you never totally know until we see these games, but it feels like on paper, Michigan's got a little tougher assignment. You got everything that's been swirling around them, although they seem somehow impervious to all of it. And you're going to Maryland, and Maryland's feeling a little bit better about themselves, pulling off a win last week. Anytime you go on the road, I think that's challenging. Still, this feels like if Michigan plays anywhere close to its best, they should roll into that game with Ohio State unscathed.
Yeah, before the season when the schedules came out, this was one you circled right away and said, trap game for Michigan because of where it falls between Penn State and Ohio State. Road game, fairly dangerous opponent. But the closer you get to it now, I don't think so. I mean, Michigan is so locked in. They have rallied around the situation around them, whether it's legitimate or not. It only matters within the locker room how they feel about it in terms of whether they've been fairly dealt with or not. And clearly, they are using it for all the motivational fuel they can get. So I don't think Michigan in any way goes into College Park and isn't focused, isn't ready to go. And if you're Maryland, look, yes, you stop the bleeding. You got to ground out a win. The one thing you cannot do is turn the ball over the way they have the last 2 games. They've had 7 turnovers. You do that against Michigan, you're going to get run out badly. So got to protect the football, try to make some plays in the passing game, try to slow down the Michigan blunt force rushing game. We'll see if they get around to throwing the ball or not this week. But I like where Michigan's sitting from a mindset standpoint. Michigan
is as galvanized and unified as I think we could imagine any team in America being. And, of course, a lot of that seemingly the factors that surround the program and surround, the perception of Michigan football right now. So the task for Maryland is even heavier now because of that. Now, by comparison with the opponent last week, it feels odd to say because Penn State is one of the most exceptional teams in the country and Michigan was able to just have 30 runs to close the game out, and Penn State didn't seem to be able to do a lot about it. Maryland's defense got back to form a bit last week, so I think that was a positive thing for Brian Williams and what he was able to do for Mike Locksley in that scenario. But that being said, this is going to be a different animal, a different test, because Michigan doesn't have to run it 30 times. They just did because they could. They did because that was a formula that was accessible to them. But we know the level of play they've gotten from J.J. McCarthy throughout the season. So I do think on the whole, Maryland's defense and what the Terps' defense can be will be aided by their offense. Michigan is going to face an offense this week that has more versatility to it than what Penn State has been for most of this year. So it will be a task for Michigan's defense to figure out how do they, and Talia Tagovailoa, aside from the turnovers, which are certainly a part of the resume here, but he's been playing really well. They do, to Pat's point, have to protect the football, but the explosive play that Michigan hasn't necessarily given up much this season, Maryland's offense is capable of that. And you look back to that game last season, man, did they give Michigan some fits.
They did. We have certainly seen moments from this Maryland team that make you think, maybe like you did at the beginning of the year, as Pat said, that this could be a troubling game. We just haven't seen them very consistently from the Terps. So they would have to play far and away their best game of the year to really give Michigan trouble in this one. Finally, I do want to talk about Iowa. They will take on Illinois. I continue to cling to the belief that Illinois can be a good, solid team, and we saw some evidence of that last week, certainly offensively. I mean, putting up a historic performance from John Paddock, who came in, the backup quarterback throwing for more than 500 yards. But now I know you guys had Brett Bielema on Big Ten Radio this morning, and he divulged that John Paddock will once again be the backup quarterback. Let me in on this.
He did. He told us this morning that Luke Altmaier will be the starter. He was cleared medically yesterday and said that it could have been a little bit close, a little bit touchy even last week, but they certainly didn't want to press Luke Altmaier back into action there. And he said it's a great position to be in, to have two quarterbacks who you feel confident in. And Luke Altmaier had been playing really well, one of his better games of the season against Minnesota, and was beginning to lead a game-winning drive, and then he leaves with an injury. John Paddock comes in, 3 passes against the Gophers, 500-plus yards last week against IU. This is a different animal facing the Iowa Hawkeyes, though. That defense, especially at Kinnick Stadium. It feels to me like the mobility of Luke Altmaier versus what John Paddock was able to do, both in the pocket and outside the pocket, as a passer, when you're facing that Hawkeye defense, to have a multi-dimensional talent at QB like Luke Altmaier presents, it does still feel like, that will likely give the Illini the best opportunity for movement of the football, for success. But, yeah, I mean, the hot hand sitting it on the bench is certainly not a small decision Brett Bielema makes.
No, again, Luke Altmaier, once he started cutting down on the turnovers. At the beginning of the year, he was a little bit of a turnover machine. But we're talking about a guy who's third in the Big Ten total offense. As you say, he can really beat you with his legs. But this is a tough spot to be in here, Pat, to have to make that decision. And Brett Bielema just putting his cards out on the table and saying, Altmaier's the guy.
Yeah, Anthony Herron, newsbreaker. Way to get that information on the radio today. Look, coaches, this is what they always say. You're not at practice. You don't see all the tape. You don't think about everything. I still don't understand this. I really don't. I mean, what John Paddock has given them has been incredible. I mean, that was a heck of a throw to win the game against Minnesota, and then you come back and throw for 500 yards, and the answer is go to the bench? I mean, that really surprises me. I just think that you at least start the game and give this guy a chance to keep that hot hand, keep rolling, see what you can do. If he's getting swarmed and swallowed by the pass rush, if his lack of mobility has become an issue, if he's not hitting receivers, okay, bring in Luke Altmaier. But, boy, I would have a hard time telling a guy after two of the biggest moments of the season for Illinois that you're no longer the starting quarterback.
It is a very big decision for Brett Bielema, where everyone not named Purdue is still in the hunt for the West Division title. Iowa's offense took a step last week also.
Yes.
So that's a big deal that we've kind of run out of time to talk about here, but it matters.
We have 3 hot quarterbacks in this game. Count Deacon Hill in as well. More football still to come from the Big Ten. Last night included the annual Champions Classic in Chicago, right down the road from us at the United Center. Michigan State led early, hung around most of the way against Duke, but the Blue Devils ended the first half on a 13-1 run, largely controlled from there. 74-65, MSU falling to 1-2. They're 3-14 against the Blue Devils under Tom Izzo, and to that I would say join the club. A lot of people are 3-14 against the Blue Devils. Andy Katz is here with us. You were there last night. Among the celebrities at the United Center was Andy Katz. What'd you make of Michigan State's performance, first off?
Okay, so they played better. Obviously, we're not trying to give out little prizes for improvement here. But they did play better than last week when they lost at home to James Madison and beat Southern Indiana. The problem is that, once again, their veteran guys are not playing consistently well. A.J. Hogarth's in a big-time slump right now, 1 of 8. Yes, they made 6 threes because that had been a major problem for them throughout the course of the season. But they just don't have the veteran guys playing for 40 minutes, for 20 minutes, for 10 minutes. And then you bring in the freshmen, and maybe they'll play well for a couple possessions. And you can see the frustration, and I talked to him last night from Tom Izzo, that the shots are there. He's not upset about the shots they're taking.
They're getting good looks, yes.
They're not falling. And then defensively, he was really frustrated. This is now the second of 3 games, so second loss, where someone who we hadn't really heard of or hadn't really taken note of on the other team has become a star. You know, where it's Terrence Edwards for James Madison, or last night, Caleb Foster, who was sort of the unheralded Duke freshman. He has 18, 2 times crushing threes in the corner on, nice passes across the lane, and buries the 3, and those were daggers when Foster hit those, which are missed assignments defensively.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack from Michigan State's point of view. As you said, they shot it a little bit better. I do feel like the Malik Hall portion of it, like if you're going to take some positives from the night, Malik Hall played well, and they need him to be good. you do wonder, like, do you play Jeremy Fears a little more at the expense of A.J. Hogard, or do you try to let him get back into the flow? But you can see why there's some frustration from Tom. Again, it's an elite team you're playing in Duke, but falling to the Blue Devils there. What about Illinois? Lost at home to number 4 Marquette. It just felt like offensively they were stagnant. Some similarities to what we talked about last year. It just shot a lot of threes. They're not a team that shoots the three all that well, though Luke Goody came in and looked good, so that's positive. But they tend to fall in love with it, and you just feel like, why don't you go inside?
You know, it's interesting. First of all, we had those 2 exhibition doubleheaders on our air on that Sunday, October 29th. I was there for Kansas, Illinois. Of the 4 teams that played that night, really only Tennessee has remained consistent from there, because Kansas didn't play well then. They obviously played well last night in beating Kentucky. Michigan State still has not really played well. And Illinois, conversely, played great that night and has not really since then, even though they were winning before last night. Coleman Hawkins in that game against Kansas, he played really well. Yeah. He hasn't scored in double figures this season in games that matter.
5 turnovers last night, too.
So, again, he has to play well. Quincy Guerriere, the transfer who's bounced around from Syracuse to Oregon to Illinois, who Brad Underwood is counting on, again, a non-factor. And these transfers, especially the 5th-year guys or 6th-year guys in some instances, if they're going to play, they have to matter when they're on the floor. They can't hurt you. And so he's going to have to step up a little bit more. Yes, it's good Luke Goody is playing well, but they're going to have to get more production from these transfers, and especially the returning like Coleman Hawkins.
15 turnovers as well, which isn't so good. They got nothing from Dane Danger. Did not score in that game. Iowa, look, this is a really tough assignment going on the road to Creighton. Creighton is very good. This was a tie game at halftime, and then Creighton pulled away. Although, you know, like there was a period where it looked like Creighton might really bury them and give Iowa credit. They showed some moxie and kind of fought back. There are a lot of new faces on this Iowa team. I came away from last night feeling like they're going to be pretty good. They can really score, as they have been able to every year under Fran. They've got transfers who I think are fitting in nicely. I think you come out of this feeling pretty good.
Yeah, after the first week and a half, almost 2 weeks of the season, Michigan and Iowa, I think, are the 2 big surprises, even though Iowa didn't win that game against Creighton. The fact that they're scoring at will, because we wondered, okay, this is the first time going back to like the early Luka Garza where they haven't had a potential Big Ten Player of the Year or Big Ten scoring leader. But who knows? Maybe they will. Ben Krikke right now, the transfer from Valpo, he had 24 in this game. You know, Peyton Sanford, Tony Perkins, you know, these guys, and Patrick McCaffrey, they're all scoring. Now, what will happen when they get deeper into the Big Ten and it becomes a little more of a half-court game? Will they struggle there? Will they get anything off the bench? But their starting 5 right now is producing, which is a positive sign for Iowa.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to feel good about there. Kricke's been fantastic. I mean, you want to talk about a transfer who's lived up to the hype. Tony Perkins has played very well, played well again last night. We talked about him as one of those players who could emerge as an All-Big Ten player this year, and if he does, that raises the ceiling for his team early on. Good returns out of Perkins. What do we make of Wisconsin? To me, this was maybe the most disappointing results of the night. I mean, you got a veteran team. You're going to Providence, first-year head coach. They're replacing a ton of players on that team. It ended up being 13 points, but I mean, it was not a 13-point game. They were down 25 points in the final 4 minutes. Wisconsin essentially has everyone back, and yet just have not looked good here early on. What do you make of it?
Well, Greg Gard after the game was very upset with the effort, the toughness. Providence basically popped them early. I was there Friday in Madison, and I came away actually as good as Tennessee was, felt decently about Wisconsin because they hung around against a potential Final Four team, and you saw improvement. And then literally 4 days later, the bottom falls out. Their veterans haven't played well. Tyler Wall has still not gotten back to where he was pre-injury. They need him to do so. Basically, I mean, in talking to them this morning, John Blackwell and Nolan Winter were sort of the only guys that were giving them a spark. And I would say Storr, the transfer from St. John's.
Yes.
You know, he has been consistent for them, giving them a little bit more energy, athleticism. But, I mean, Stephen Kral, Tyler Wall, Chucky Hepburn, Max Klesmer,
total non-factor.
Connor Esigian. That's 5 guys that we all expected them to produce, and they haven't. And they've got a really, really tough schedule.
Right.
They got Virginia coming up. They're going to play Arizona. So the Badgers potentially could be digging themselves a hole. I know it's only mid-November, but they're going to have to win one or two of these kind of games before they even get into the Big Ten.
Right. I mean, you get the nice thing about college basketball is you get rewarded for playing that schedule. So people understand.
But you got to at least win one or two of them.
But I agree with you wholeheartedly. You have to figure out a way to win them. It just the fact that they still can't dump the ball inside and get a basket, I think, is concerning because you look at Wall and Crowell and you say they should be able to, right?
Yes.
Like it's such a staple of what they do. So we'll see. Again, one of the tenets of Wisconsin basketball through the years is they play tough competition, they get better. They are a developmental program, so we'll see where it goes. Hoping for against Oakland, they fell in a competitive game against Texas A&M. What do you make of the Buckeyes at this point as they try to bounce back from last year's disappointment?
Well, in communicating with Ohio State, their main concern is what they're doing from the perimeter at home. They're only shooting 25% on threes at Ohio State. That has to improve. It can't all be Bruce Thornton. He's been taking way too many shots. They need to distribute that a little bit more. Roddy Gale, though, has been very consistent for them.
Right.
The big X factor here is Jamison Battle. He's still trying to figure out where he fits on this roster with this talent because this is the most talent he's ever played with. And so does he defer? Does he become more assertive? They brought him in there to be a scorer. And now he's just got to figure that out, especially here going forward.
I know Chris Holtman is interested in seeing how they respond in this game because Merrimack plays a zone, and he wants to kind of see how his team will respond to that. But again, Buckeyes, they're going to have to do some stuff better, going to have to rebound better, particularly on the defensive glass. But so far, roughly to form, I think, of what you would expect. What about Rutgers? They get Georgetown, a Hoyas team that's rebuilding under Ed Cooley, not expected to be a great
Just lost
team
to Holy Cross at home
this year. Yeah, no, saw that. Got some high-level transfers, but this is a game, if you're Rutgers and at home as they are, it's a game you feel like you should win. What have you taken from Rutgers? The early loss to Princeton and then a couple of wins.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm not trying to excuse it, but that was a very difficult opener. Neutral court in Trenton, going against a Princeton team that I know was not the same from the Sweet 16, but still a difficult game if you're not all together. For Rutgers, they're very pleased with Andre Hyatt's early production. Cliff Amori had 15 rebounds the other night. Gavin Griffiths of West Hartford, Connecticut.
Yes, all the great ones come from West Hartford.
25 in his home debut, and Derek Simpson playing well. So they're feeling pretty good. This is a game, like you said, though, they should win at home against a Georgetown team that's still rebuilding. So we'll see if they can build off this momentum of sort of lesser competition. They just beat Bryant as they go forward here.
We saw some potential, and Griffiths had one really good game.
Yes.
He's really highly touted. Can he help them as he's a versatile player. He can go inside, go outside, but can he help them with the outside shooting? That has been an issue. They were a bad outside shooting team last year.
A bad scoring team last year.
Yeah. Lost Cam Spencer, who was maybe their best three-point shooter, although he went through ups and downs, and it's been worse, actually, this year. Nebraska gets Stony Brook tonight. Nebraska's 3-0. Like, I realize it's not great competition, but, man, they have looked good. They are exciting. They're fun to watch. They've plugged in some transfers who have been really good. I'm fired up about this team, and without Keisei Tominaga at 100%, he played all the first couple games and looked a little rusty the other night. But, man, when they get him going again, Andy, this is a team you have to feel good about.
They're not even healthy overall. I mean, now that we get the Big Ten injury reports before these games, Nebraska is the only team right now that's got multiple players that still are not healthy. So Fred Hoiberg actually did a great job in scheduling. Maybe not for the tournament. We'll see what happens. But he's got a lot of home games here early, lesser competition, especially with these injuries, to build confidence. That's what they've not had in the past early in the season. And Tominaga came out, played well in that first game. I really think they are playing some of the best basketball in the Big Ten. We'll see if it translates as the competition improves. I'm going to circle a game that I'm going to be there for BTN December 10th. They host Michigan State. It's going to be a very difficult game for the Spartans, but that's going to be a great barometer for Nebraska in a few weeks. Where are they? Home game against the Spartans. That's the kind of game that they could win.
Clearly a better team, I think, well, certainly than they were early last year. Again, they played fairly well down the stretch a season ago, actually really well. But some of the transfers they plugged in, Rink Mass has been really good. Alex been solid for them. So a lot to be excited about there. Interested in your take on Michigan. They are 3-0, and they are crushing people. I mean, they obliterated St. John's in the Garden. Like, I understand, first-year program, Rick Pitino, but it's Rick Pitino. I mean, they destroyed
There was tons of hype coming back to the Garden.
Destroyed them.
But Phil Martelli is a pretty good coach.
He is.
And I will say he does give a lot of credit. He does a great job of deflecting, and he's pointed out to me that Howard Isley and Sadie Washington have done a great job, respectively, with Doug McDaniel and Burnett, the transfer from Texas Tech. Those guys have played phenomenal. They've kept things simple. He was telling me how McDaniel focused more on his practice habits, translating to games, and he's become one of the best players in the Big Ten.
Right.
Arguably, he was, the best player on the floor the other night against St. John's, and Michigan now elevates itself up into a team that we are going to have to track that potentially could be a tournament team throughout the course of the season. Their schedule will get harder, but that was a great indicator that they are here to stay, going on the road and really diffusing all that hype about Pitino back in the Garden with St. John's.
Burnett was incredible. At the beginning of that game, he was as hot can be. And you understand, like, guy was a McDonald's All-American.
Yes.
You watch him for 5 minutes of that game, you're like, I get that. I understand. What about Indiana? What do you make of the Hoosiers so far? It's been a little bit underwhelming here against lesser opposition. They played single-digit margin games. They're winning them, but it just doesn't feel like it's clicking from where I sit. What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's all about effort and how hard they're playing, which I think they've gotten popped early. An Army team that really struggled in their couple first non-conference games, and they come in and they're leading for a significant part of that game and really were right there, possession for possession. Khalil Ware, the transfer from Oregon, 16-9. So, I mean, if he can produce that on a consistent basis, that's key for Indiana. But their guard play, we came in with all this hype with Xavier Johnson and Trey Galloway. They have to elevate. And I know Johnson didn't play for most of last season, but they're going to have a monster test Sunday in the Garden against UConn. We'll see if Ware can sort of offset Klingon from UConn, but the guard play is going to have to be elite for them to at least be right there to win that game.
There was a lot of excitement about McKenzie and Baco too, and it just really hasn't translated to this point. Looks a little bit lost defensively. Sometimes that happens with young players, and you got to give them time to figure it out. I think that's one of the hard things with these highly touted freshmen, where people just expect you to come in and be a panacea. But they've the defensive end has been a challenge. They've given up a lot of open, uncontested threes. All right, good stuff, man.
Thank you.
Good to have you back on Big Ten today. Pac-5, Anthony is going to rate the top 5 non-quarterbacks.
Yep.
Who could make an impact.
Don't need them
down the stretch. I do think you need them.
I mean, I suppose you're supposed to have one in the lineup.
It's really important to have a quarterback. But the quarterbacks are too easy, and you like to challenge yourself a little more.
Very much so.
So let's do it. Let's count it down 5-1, Letterman style. Where are you starting?
I prefer to start Seacrest style if I can. And I'm going to start on the defensive side of the football. A team that surprisingly hasn't attained bowl eligibility yet in the Minnesota Golden Gophers, but the safety position is where they've made some exceptional plays led by Tyler Nubin. There's also been a few breakdowns in coverage because he's so great at anticipating the flight of the ball, and he's so fluid in his hips. And so he has made a lot of plays on the back end at times, game-sealing plays. But what I think, even in addition to the tangible of Tyler Nubin, the intangible for a defense that's still inexperienced and a bit banged up at this point, especially at the second level, the leadership of Tyler Nubin, who is kind of their alpha on that side of the football, has to show up for the Gophers in a difficult closing stretch to make sure that a season that just a couple of weeks ago, they looked like the frontrunners. They were the frontrunners in the West Division a couple of weeks back after a dramatic win in Iowa City. Tyler Nubin has to be a guy for the Gophers that really rises up and makes sure that his game and, frankly, his demeanor end up leading his team here. I think when you move on to number 4.
Yeah,
then
please
it's
do.
a guy, I will. I think moving on to number 4 is a player on the offensive side of the football that, the way that Michigan ran the football at the end of that game the other day, you can make a case for a bunch of guys on the offensive line, the running back position, and beyond. But what Roman Wilson means for them on offense, I think, is going to be a huge key for the Wolverines, because even though they don't need to pass the football at a high level, he's been a guy who's been underrated this season for Michigan's offense because they haven't necessarily needed him. He's not Marvin Harrison Jr. He's not one of these guys who's amongst the elite talents overall in the sport, but he's had highlight reel grabs. Statistically, he's been spectacular. And anytime J.J. McCarthy needs that security blanket as a passer, we've seen Roman Wilson rise up again and again. And I think the separating factor in a season where Ohio State's run game has been excellent, but not throughout the season as dominant as we saw last week and what they were last year, Roman Wilson has really gone underrated in what he's meant to their offense.
Did not catch a pass in that Penn State game, to your point. Didn't really need him when the Wolverines were just running it down the Nittany Lions' throats. How about numbers 3 and 2?
I think for Olu Fashanu and what the Penn State offensive line has been at times this season, you think about the dominance that he's shown, and if Penn State has another gear, it can't all be about Drew Allard. But what is their offensive approach now that they've moved on from Mike Yurcich? So now you got co-coordinators there, James Franklin taking more of a leadership role in how the plays will be called offensively. Also, you got one of the best offensive tackles in the country. You've got Olu Fashanu. Can it be making sure that his dominance is accentuated in your offense, that it's accentuated in the where and when you run the football, and recognizing that not only his athleticism and pass protection, but he absolutely rolls people off the ball as a run blocker. And I think Olu Fashanu, as a guy who can be that stabilizing force up front for them offensively, and just featuring him in the run game, both at the point of attack and at times out in space, moving him, pulling him. That's where Penn State's run game can continue to insulate a quarterback and an offense as a whole that needs to find something they can really lean on and believe in. And I believe Olu Fashanu can be that guy. We know who that guy is for the Illini, though. My number 2 on this list is a guy who's basically the ninth wonder of the world. Johnny Newton is a player who is unmatched in his productivity, unmatched in the impact that he has for Illinois, that he has in the Big Ten Conference as a whole for just every snap of the football. Eyes go to him. Multiple pass protectors at all times. Multiple offensive players trying to figure out where is number 4? How do we avoid him? How do we run away from him? One thing Brett Bielema pointed out to me this morning, we had him on Big Ten Radio, not only the way Johnny Newton defeats blocks, but then that closing burst for a former high school running back. After he gets into the backfield, he can run a running back down from the backside. He runs quarterbacks down from the backside. It's just fun to watch the way that he impacts the game every snap.
We'll see if he can impact it here as they try to wrap up one more win for a bowl game. Iowa and Northwestern final 2 games for the Fighting Illini. Gets us to number 1. Where are you going?
It's a player who, out of all the talent that Ohio State has access to, especially on offense, all the playmakers available, the guy who seems to me to make the biggest difference for the Buckeyes when he's on the field, and we've noticed it when he hasn't been out there, is TreVeyon Henderson. That offense just moves differently when they hand him the football, and his versatility as a pass receiver out of the backfield as well. I got to call a lot of games of Christian McCaffrey's when he was in college at Stanford, and just watching his progression from a high school player to a collegiate player, and being a guy who he knew he had a burst and he had vision, he could hit the hole and get into the open field. But the creativity that developed for Christian McCaffrey later in his year is what made him a Heisman candidate. We haven't seen TreVeyon Henderson on the field as much in his Buckeye career via injury, but I'm seeing that type of progression. A guy as a pass receiver who looks like a wide receiver at times with his comfort and the way he can catch the football so cleanly. But then also when he gets the football, he's not just counting on bursts. He's not just counting on sort of some finishing power. He will make people miss. He is as elusive as they come. And it would have been fun to see the full scope of what he could have had available this season. I think he would have had New York potential if he was able to be on the field this season for the bulk of the time. But having him now and healthy and that finishing burst that he provides every time he touches the football, he is a guy who the Buckeyes will certainly continue to focus and feature.
He has been special, no doubt about it, since he came back from the injury. Pat, we always leave this open for your rebuttal. I mean, we got a list of the top 5 guys. It does not include Marvin Harrison. Does not include Marvin Harrison. So that might be a place to start with your rebuttal. But I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Well, yeah, I mean, Anthony did leave me a bit of an opening there. The Marvin Harrison guy, I've heard he's pretty good. I think he might be a factor down the stretch. But you know what? How about the guy that may be spending some time covering him in that game November 25th, too? Will Johnson.
Yeah.
Outstanding cornerback for Michigan, has the size, has the athleticism to maybe match up, and I can't wait to see that matchup there, because that's 2 special players that are, I think, going to go on to great professional careers as well. Also, the Ohio State rush ends, JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer. And again, I'm projecting ahead. I apologize, November 25th. I can't wait for that matchup, but somebody's got to keep after J.J. McCarthy, and those two guys can do it. And if you can disrupt him, if you can keep him from having those big running gains that he had against Penn State, I would also then throw in Cooper DeJean, who still remains the most important non-offensive player in the league. And if Iowa's going to get to Indy, he's going to have to keep making plays for the Hawkeyes.
Pretty good list from both of you
bad.
guys.
Yeah.
I think Pat is excused from looking ahead to the game.
You don't want to see the coaches
25th.
doing it.
A lot of us are looking
Yeah,
ahead
right.
to the game November 25th. We got the dramatic conclusion 10 Coach of the Year conversation, and I think certainly after that game against Wisconsin, all the players took to social media and basically said, remove the tag. In other words, he shouldn't be the interim anymore. So where do you put him in your Big Ten Coach of the Year race? And what do you see in terms of his long-term future in Evanston?
Yeah, I put him number one, frankly. I am just so impressed by the job that Braun has done there. I was there at Big Ten Media Day. He stepped into a thankless situation and handled it with so much aplomb and conviction that right then and there I thought, wow, this guy's got a little something special for somebody who had never been a head coach before. They go out and start the season. They get hammered by Rutgers, and you're thinking, oh, man, these guys may not win any games this year. Well, they turn around. They're 5-5. They've got a chance to go to a bowl game. As you said, like you beat Wisconsin like that. That's a statement this late in the season. So I am just super impressed by what David Braun has done. I think he's done the best job in the toughest job probably in the league this year. And then, yes, should he be the head coach permanently? I would give it to him at this point. I'm not sure where their search is looking. They're not going to have the pick of the litter out there. There's many other jobs open that are probably going to be incoming open that are going to be more highly sought after. And you got a guy right there in the backyard who kept together this program in a really difficult moment and got the team behind him and has shown a lot, I think, and is only going to get better as a head coach. So if I were Northwestern, I'd probably have David Braun in the office say, let's start talking about a full-time deal. It's
so impressive that David Braun has even been able to get it to this position, right, Pat, where the discussion is valid from the results that are there on the field. And I've gotten to be there in Evanston several times this season calling those games and just watching his progression. He's been very open about the process he's gone through and evolving, being a head coach for the first time, being a Power 5 coach for the first time. Yeah. So just watching that in real time with him kind of step by step, figuring out which buttons to push, where he can be a little bit more urgent with the way that he's trying to drive players and coaches in the direction he wants the program to go. And he's done it with such, in his words, a servant attitude. So there's a humility in the approach he's taken that just feels really gratifying for the position that he's found himself in. Now, where does Northwestern Athletics really want to go with that? Are they looking for more experience? There's questions there that will have to be answered. But I think for the Big Ten Coach of the Year, other names that could be worthy of consideration depending on how the final two games go here, Greg Schiano and Rutgers, if they can finish up in a strong way here with a couple of wins, I think he would be deserving of mention. And Kirk Ferentz, we may get tired of it because we see this formula so consistently. Doesn't make it easy. And I think that the heart palpitations from Iowa fans so consistently from these games that are decided in the final moments, but just to be able to do that week in and week out, winning these tight games, Kirk Ferentz certainly deserves that discussion.
They've been through a lot, no doubt. Hey, Pat, I do want to ask you about another coaching search that's going on in the Big Ten. Michigan State obviously looking for a new head coach. Texas A&M, as we know, let go of Jimbo Fisher this week. How much crossover do you think there might be between those two?
I think there will be some crossover there, certainly starting with Mike Elko, who's a former defensive coordinator at Texas A&M and has done great work at Duke, and I know Michigan State's had their eyes on him, so what's the competition level there between those two? And then also Lance Leipold at Kansas, who I think's a hot name on the market and might get some attention from both of those places. I think he's a better fit at Michigan State than A&M. We'll see how it breaks down.
Both really good football coaches.